You already know what 3 a.m. feels like. Not the hour itself, but the weight of it. The way the darkness doesn't comfort you, it confronts you. The way your own mind, the one you rely on all day, suddenly becomes the loudest room in the house. You didn't choose to be awake, and yet, here you are, again. They move through the day with quiet efficiency. They smile at the right moments. They answer emails, hold conversations, carry responsibilities on their shoulders like it weighs nothing. To the outside world, they appear composed, functional, maybe even strong. But then night falls, and something shifts. The house grows still, the notifications slow. The world that demanded so much of them finally turns its back and goes to sleep. And in that silence, that vast, unguarded silence, something rises. Not peace, not rest. Something older than rest. Something restless. It is 3 a.m., and the mind that held itself together all day long begins to come apart at the seams. Not violently, not dramatically, quietly, like a river that has been dammed all day, finally finding the cracks. The thoughts come without invitation. Did I say the wrong thing? Why do I feel so alone in a room full of people? Is this the life I actually chose, or the life I learned to survive? Why can't I just be enough? And you lie there, eyes open, ceiling staring back at you like a blank page you were supposed to fill but never knew how. This is not insomnia, not in the clinical sense. This is something more intimate, more ancient. This is the soul refusing to be silenced any longer. And tonight, in this space, in this quiet between us, we are going to talk about what is really happening at 3 a.m. Not the symptoms, not the productivity hacks, not the breathing exercises that silence the noise for 20 minutes before it returns. We are going to go deeper, because the person who overthinks at 3 a.m. is not broken. They are not weak. They are not their diagnosis or their disorder, or the label someone once pressed into them like a stamp. They are a wounded soul searching for peace, and somewhere in that restlessness, if we are willing to be honest enough, there is a map back to themselves. Let us begin with the brain, not to reduce you to neurons and chemistry, but to offer you the compassion that understanding brings. Deep inside the architecture of your mind, there is a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. It does not speak in language. It does not reason. It does not weigh options or consider context. It simply feels. It scans every moment of your existence for threat, not just physical danger, but emotional danger. The danger of being abandoned, of being humiliated, of being unseen. And here is what most people don't understand. The amygdala does not distinguish between the past and the present. When you were 8 years old and your parent walked into the room with that particular tension in their jaw, that silence that meant something was wrong, but no one would tell you what, your amygdala logged that moment, filed it away under threat, uncertainty. You are not safe here. Decades later, at 3 a.m., when a minor conflict from yesterday replays on a loop in your mind, it is not because you are irrational. It is because your amygdala is still that 8-year-old, still watching the door, still waiting for the explanation that never came. This is what psychologists call the internalized neglect schema, a fragile tapestry of beliefs woven in childhood about what we deserve, how much space we are allowed to take up, and whether the world is fundamentally safe or fundamentally threatening. If you grew up in an environment where your emotional needs were consistently minimized, where being too sensitive was a criticism, not a compassionate observation, you learned to suppress. You learned to perform. You built a beautifully constructed mask, competent on the outside, turbulent within. And here is the cruel irony of suppression. The thoughts you refuse to think during the day don't disappear. They accumulate. They gather mass and momentum in the dark corners of your psyche. And when the mask finally comes off, when the performance ends and the house is quiet, they surface, not as gentle whispers, but as a flood. 3 a.m. is simply the hour when the mask has no choice but to slip. There is also a concept in psychology called metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. Deep thinkers, sensitively wired individuals, tend to have a highly developed metacognitive capacity. They don't just experience a feeling, they observe themselves feeling it. They don't just have a thought, they examine the thought from 12 different angles. This is simultaneously a gift and a wound. The gift is depth, the wound is exhaustion. When metacognition turns inward in the silence of night, without structure, without purpose, without a destination, it becomes rumination. The mind, designed for meaning-making, finds no resolution in the dark, and so it circles and circles again. Not because it is broken, but because it is searching. It is searching for what it was never given, safety. Resolution.peace. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent his life mapping the geography of the human soul, spoke of the persona, not a mask in the theatrical sense, but something more pervasive. The persona is the identity we construct for the world, the role we play, the version of ourselves that is acceptable, presentable, lovable. For the person who overthinks at 3 a.m., the persona is often magnificent. They are the dependable one, the strong one, the one who holds it together, the one others lean on, never suspecting that beneath that steady surface, a silent storm has been raging for years. Jung understood something essential. The more rigid and polished the persona, the more turbulent the inner world it conceals. Because every quality we deny in ourselves, every emotion we refuse to feel, every need we dismiss as weakness, doesn't disappear. It descends into what Jung called the shadow, the unacknowledged self, the grief that has nowhere to go. And at 3 a.m. the shadow speaks. It speaks in the language of regret, of the apology you never received, of the version of your life you imagined when you were 12, before you learned to make yourself smaller. It speaks of the love you wanted and didn't ask for, because somewhere along the way, you decided you didn't deserve to ask. This invisible grief, this ancestral echo of what was never given and never mourned, is perhaps the most misunderstood form of pain. Because it has no clear narrative, no singular wound you can point to. It is the cumulative weight of 1,000 small moments. 1,000 times your feelings were waved away. 1,000 times you swallowed the tears because they weren't convenient. We live in a world that celebrates productivity and performance. A world that applauds the person who is always okay, always available, always adding value. We have built entire economies around the suppression of inner life. And so the person who feels deeply learns to feel privately. They become fluent in the language of invisibility. They exist in two worlds simultaneously. The bright, functional world everyone can see, and the interior world, rich, aching, vast, that almost no one is invited into. This duality is exhausting in ways that are almost impossible to describe, because it is not just the pain that tires you. It is the performance of not being in pain, the constant translation between what you feel and what you allow yourself to show. And at 3 a.m., when the translation finally ceases, when the performance has no audience, what remains is the truth of you, raw, unedited, and desperately in need of witnessing. The tragedy is that many people interpret this moment, this 3 a.m. rawness, as evidence of their weakness. They berate themselves for not being over it already, for still carrying the weight of something that happened years ago, for being, as they often say, too much. But what if it isn't weakness at all? What if it is depth? What if the capacity to feel this intensely, to remember this vividly, to care this persistently, is not a dysfunction, but a form of intelligence that our culture simply has not learned to honor? There is a particular kind of loneliness that has no name in most languages. It is not the loneliness of being physically alone. It is not the loneliness of having no one around you. It is something far more disorienting. The loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen. Of speaking and not being truly heard. Of sharing a room, a meal, a life with someone, and still returning to yourself each night with the quiet, aching sense that no one quite reached you. This is the loneliness of depth, and it lives most loudly at 3 a.m. The deeply feeling person does not connect on the surface. They cannot. Small talk feels like a performance they were never given the script for. They want to talk about the thing beneath the thing, the fear behind the ambition, the grief inside the laughter, the question that keeps you awake long after the conversation has ended. And when they cannot find that, when the people around them want only the surface, they retreat. Not out of arrogance, out of exhaustion, because performing shallowness when you are built for depth is one of the most quietly devastating things a person can do to themselves. Psychologists who study attachment understand this well. The person who grew up in an environment where their emotional depth was met with discomfort, where being too intense, too sensitive, too much was a recurring criticism, often develops what is called an avoidant anxious attachment pattern. They crave deep connection with an intensity that frightens them, and simultaneously they expect that connection to disappoint them. So they stay in the doorway, close enough to feel warmth, far enough to survive the cold when it comes. And it always comes, or so they believe. At 3 a.m., this pattern surfaces not as a thought but as a feeling in the chest, a hollow resonance. The memory of a conversation where you tried to go deeper and watch the other person's eyes glaze over. The relationship where you gave everything and received only the fraction of yourself that felt safe to the other. There is a metaphor that has always moved me. Imagine the ocean, not the surface, the waves that rise and crash and scatter into foam, but the ocean itself, the vast, still depth beneath, the part that no storm can reach. Your thoughts at 3 a.m. are the waves, urgent, consuming, real. But you, the one observing the thoughts, the one lying in the dark and watching them roll, you are the ocean. You are not the wave. You are the depth from which the wave rises and into which it inevitably returns. This is not a spiritual platitude. It is a neurological truth. Between every stimulus and every response, there exists a space, a pause. Viktor Frankl, who survived the unspeakable darkness of Nazi concentration camps and emerged with a philosophy of meaning, wrote that in that pause lies our freedom, our capacity to choose who we are, regardless of what has been done to us. The practice of finding that pause, what contemplative traditions call sacred stillness, is not about silencing the thoughts. It is about learning to hold them differently, to observe them with curiosity rather than terror, to say there is a wave, not I am drowning. This is the beginning of what Carl Jung called individuation, the lifelong project of becoming more fully and authentically yourself, not the self your family needed you to be, not the self your culture rewards, but the self that exists beneath the persona, the one who was always there, waiting in the silence. Individuation is not comfortable. It requires us to descend into the shadow, to acknowledge the grief we buried, the anger we converted into perfectionism, the loneliness we called independence. It requires above all radical honesty with ourselves. And this is where the 3 a.m. mind, for all its suffering, holds a hidden gift. Because in the silence, in that unguarded hour, the defenses are down. The carefully constructed narrative of who you are, the story you tell others, and more crucially yourself, grows thin. And through the cracks, something true begins to emerge. The question you've been avoiding, the relationship that drains you, the life you are living out of habit rather than choice, the version of yourself you abandoned at some unnamed crossroads because it felt too risky, too different, too much. These are not intrusive thoughts. They are invitations. The mind that cannot sleep at 3 a.m. is often a mind that is trying to finish something, to process an experience that was never properly digested, to grieve a loss that was never permitted, to ask a question that was never allowed. The path forward is not suppression. It is not the forced positivity that exhausts you, because it requires you to be perpetually untrue. It is something quieter and more demanding. It is the willingness to sit with yourself, to be present to your own pain without immediately trying to fix it or flee from it. Psychologists call this affect tolerance, the ability to feel a feeling fully without being destroyed by it. It is built slowly, through practice, through small acts of self-witnessing, through asking, what am I actually feeling right now? Not what should I be feeling, not what is appropriate to feel, but what is true. This is the alchemy of the wound, not the elimination of pain, but its transformation, not the erasure of the past, but the integration of it into a larger, more compassionate story of yourself. A story where the 3 a.m. person is not the problem, they are the protagonist, and their restlessness, for all its difficulty, is the engine of their becoming. I want to speak to you directly now, not as a subject of study, not as a psychological archetype, but as a human being who carries something heavy, who has spent years being quietly extraordinary on the outside while quietly struggling within, who has wondered in the small hours if this restlessness, this depth, this inability to simply switch off will ever end. You are not broken, you are buried. There is a difference. Broken things cannot be restored, but buried things are waiting. Buried things still have roots. Buried things are still alive. The path to healing does not begin with fixing. It begins with witnessing. It begins with the radical act of sitting with yourself at 3 a.m. and saying, instead of what is wrong with me, what is it that I am carrying? What is asking to be seen right now? What truth, long suppressed, is finally brave enough to surface? This is not a quick path. It is not the path of 10 tips or 5 habits or 30 days to a better you. It is the path of self-reconciliation. The slow, sacred process of making peace with every part of yourself you were taught was unacceptable. It begins with small acts of internal honesty. Journaling at 3 a.m. not to solve, but to release. Therapy, not as crisis intervention, but as regular maintenance for a complex inner world. Silence chosen consciously. Not the silence of suppression, but the sanctuary of stillness. The deliberate pause in which you remember who you are beneath all the performance. It involves grieving, properly, the childhood that did not offer you what you needed. Not to blame, but to acknowledge, because you cannot heal what you refuse to name. It involves learning to set boundaries, not as a strategy of self-protection, but as an act of self-respect. Understanding that your sensitivity is not a liability. It is a form of intelligence, and intelligence deserves to be protected. It involves, above all, learning to be ordinary, to let go of the identity of the one who holds it all together, to discover that beneath the extraordinary performance, there is an ordinary human being, fallible, tender, in need of rest, and that this human being is worthy of love without conditions attached. There is a question that visits you at 3 a.m. that you rarely allow yourself to ask in daylight. Who am I, really? Not the role, not the title, not the version of you that shows up on time, says the right things, and carries everyone else's weight with a steadiness that borders on performance. But you, the one underneath all of that. At 3 a.m., the architecture of your constructed identity begins to tremble. The labels you were given in childhood, the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who doesn't make a fuss, suddenly feel less like descriptions and more like cages. And something deeper stirs, something that was there before the world told you who to be. Psychologists call this the identity project, the lifelong, often unconscious work of separating who we truly are from who we were shaped to become. For most people, this work happens slowly, in therapy offices, or in the aftermath of loss, or at crossroads that demand a reckoning. But for the deep thinker, the sensitive soul, it happens at 3 a.m., uninvited, relentless. And it is terrifying, because if you strip away the persona, the performance, the carefully maintained image, what remains? The answer, when you are brave enough to sit with it, is both simpler and more profound than you expect. What remains is a self that has always known what it wanted, a self that has always felt things deeply and truly and without apology, a self that chose safety over authenticity, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. The wisdom of a child who learned early what was permitted and what was not. That self did not disappear. It went quiet. It learned to wait. And at 3 a.m., in the sacred stillness of an unguarded mind, it speaks. The question is no longer, who am I? The question becomes, am I finally ready to listen? We began tonight with a certain kind of person, the kind who lies awake at 3 a.m. while the world sleeps, whose mind turns the same stone over and over, not out of compulsion, but out of a deep and unrelenting need to understand, to make meaning, to find, somewhere in the architecture of their experience, a reason for the pain that might also be a reason for the beauty. I want to leave you with this. The same mind that keeps you awake at 3 a.m. is the mind that notices the quality of light on a winter afternoon. That feels music in the body, not just the ears. That loves with a completeness that frightens and astonishes in equal measure. That cannot do anything halfway, not grief, not joy, not presence. The restless mind is not a broken mind. It is a searching mind. And searching, for all its difficulty, is how we find the things worth finding. Peace, real peace, not the performance of it, is not the absence of depth. It is the integration of it. It is learning to be, as the Zen tradition would say, the ocean and the waves simultaneously, to hold the turbulence without being consumed by it, to feel everything without losing yourself in everything. This is not achieved all at once. It is not a destination, it is a practice. A daily, imperfect, sometimes exhilarating and sometimes exhausting practice of choosing to return to yourself, to your truth, to the still center beneath the noise. And on the nights when the thoughts come and the ceiling stares back and the silence feels less like peace and more like pressure, remember this: you are not lying awake because you are weak. You are lying awake because you are alive. And the part of you that refuses to be numb, that insists on feeling, that keeps searching for something truer and deeper and more real, that part is not your wound. That part is your way home. Rest now, not because you have solved it, but because you are allowed to. The questions will still be there in the morning, and so will you. And that quiet, ordinary, miraculous fact is enough.